Okay, so we're going to get into this lecture on Chapter 9, How to Work with Session, State, and Cookies. It's literally the main topics of this chapter. It's just two big topics, session state and cookies. And so that's what we're going to focus on. And if we get into the first topic, okay, which is session state right here, slide 4 talks about, what is this doing? This is basically how we can track user information, how to track information about a user. And so we've done a little bit of this, with tracking information, aka maintaining state, right? State is just another name for like variables. Like our variables hold information. State is the current state or the current values of those variables. So when we're talking about maintaining state, we've done this a little bit already with hidden fields. So input type of hidden, we can put information in there. We've tried to avoid putting information in a query string that's up in the URL. There's a question mark followed by a variable name and some values for those variables. The two new things here are cookies and session state. Really interestingly, there's a lot of crossover between these two topics. Okay, and I'll talk about what I mean in crossover. We've also maintained state up in our routes. And so again, kind of part of the route data like customer ID number 1 up in the segment in the URL. So that would be a way. And then also last chapter, we got introduced on how to maintain data using this feature called temp data, which can be used to send data from one controller to another. Okay, but the thing about temp data is that it goes away. When we're going to learn about session state, we're going to learn to persist data a little longer, and we're going to talk about cookies, which can do the same thing. We can now persist data for days on end, right, on the client machine. So we're kind of start with this concept of a session, okay? Now a session is a browser connecting to a server. You close the browser, you close the session. And so even before you got to get, I guess the first thing to remember about HTTP, okay, and this kind of where all these conversations start, the first thing to remember about HTTP is that it's considered stateless. What does that mean? Well, a client says, give me something with a GET request, and then the server responds with that something. That's called a round trip. Okay, client request, server response, and then it forgets everything about the client, it being the server. The server forgets everything about the client. So HTTP being stateless says on these round trips, request response, like give me the home page, and then you make another request, give me the customers page. Well, the server doesn't remember your previous request. Okay, HTTP is stateless. So just traversing, the client traversing the different links on a website saying, give me this page, give me this page, give me this page. On every request, the server completely forgets about the client. Completely forgets. HTTP is stateless. You have to know that first to understand, okay, now we want to maintain state. And one way we can do that is by, hey, you're keeping an open browser window. As long as you're keeping this browser window open, we can now maintain a session variable for this connection between the client and server, for this session, right? So it's the thing to realize about sessions is that they're very temporary because the client can close them anytime they close the browser window, right? So maintaining session state, maintaining a session typically is not a long-term solution because anytime the client closes the browser window, you close the session. Okay, so you don't want to store data there necessarily long-term. Okay, in fact, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you the kind of information that Microsoft recommends putting in session variables. Okay, so if you want to maintain something for a long time, you put it in a database. Okay, if you want good data saved somewhere, you put it in a database. Okay? If you want something secure, you put it in a database. Okay? So Microsoft actually doesn't recommend like putting critical, secure, long-term storage information in session variables. Okay, let me show you what Microsoft recommends. Okay, so based on this, and this is the Microsoft Docs, right? ASP.NET Core 8.0. Session state, to read this, is storage of user data while the user browses the web app. Session state uses a store maintained by the app to persist data across requests from the client. So this is just like the first way that the server can remember you. Now, to kind of go back to this, what the server does, the server makes a session ID for you. Okay? And that session ID is going to remain on the server, and it's going to send that session ID down to the client. So now when the client makes another request, they include the session ID back to the server. So the server can say, oh, these IDs match, you know, and so now I know who you are. And so you can kind of see that in here, that the server will generate an ID, a session ID, and the next thing to realize here, these session IDs are stored in a cookie. Okay, so session variables, and you'll see this when I do a demo, these session variables are temporary in nature, they're not long-term, and they are saved in a cookie, so that session ID on the client side is saved in a cookie, and on the server side, you can actually save that session ID in a couple of places. We're going to kind of keep it in RAM, in running memory, but servers also, if you want to, another places, you could store session IDs in a database. Okay, and that's actually very commonly the case, because you know what's very commonly put in session variables is user logins, right? You can put user logins. In other words, you close the browser, you log out. Can you guys all think of a website you go to, you log in, you close the browser, you log out? I mean, your bank probably. You know, that's a really good example of a login that is saved in a session variable that when you close the browser, you log out. Okay? There are other websites that those sessions, because they're saved in cookies, they can last longer. You can configure them to last longer. And so there are some sites like, you know, social media sites, they never want to log you out, right? Sites like Facebook, they keep you logged in because that's less friction. You don't have to log in every time to use their product. Okay? So when it comes to these session variables, concept number one is there's a session ID created. That session ID is saved on the server, either in RAM or in a database. That session ID is sent down to the client, and on the client side, it's saved in the cookie, and then it's just sent back and forth for these two things to recognize each other. Okay? And they typically, sessions close when you close the window. Okay, that's kind of a normal behavior. Okay? So kind of going back to the Microsoft doc, I know I said, you know, to kind of get into this, just jump. Here's a warning. Don't store sensitive data in session state. The user might not close the browser and clear the session cookie. Some browsers maintain valid session cookies across windows. So you got to wonder, is it, when you're having a session variable, is it just for that window? Or what if you have multiple tabs? You know, it just kind of depends on the browser. It might be just for one tab, or it might be for multi-tabs. A session might not be restricted to a single user. The next user might come and use the app on the same session. I mean, there are public computers where, you know, they just kind of stay open and people use the same websites and can have the same kind of sessions. To get back into critical application data should be stored in a database. The site should continue to function without the session, so obviously not crashing. Again, session IDs are saved in a cookie. and it's sent back and forth. And session state exhibits the following behaviors. The session cookie is specific to the browser, so different browsers have different sessions. Okay. Now, the same browser with different tabs, in my experience, have the same session. Okay. But I can't say that's always been my experience. Sometimes different tabs have had different sessions in the past. Okay. In my more recent experience, same session, different tabs. I will also say it seems like there's a lot of ways for sessions to expire. The client can close the window. The server can also expire the session, right? So there's a lot of ways for this to expire and the data to go away. Okay, empty sessions aren't retained. Okay, you can clear it programmatically with session.clear. Okay, it's not marked critical. So what is stored in a session is typically, who's logged in, maybe a username, maybe like a user preference, like how many items are in a shopping cart, on this session. Whether you're persisting that is kind of up to you. So like, hey, this user's added 5 items to a cart. It's like small pieces of data, right? I wouldn't say, again, critical pieces of data you don't put in session. Critical you put in a database. Okay, so user settings, usernames, basic stuff like that. Yeah. Login attempts. I mean, that's valid. Yeah. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to code a new, let's code a simple demonstration of using session variables. And so let me open up Visual Studio. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just very simply put something into a session variable and pull it back out. Okay, so I'm going to start by creating a new project. And ASP.NET Core. We'll call this session demo. Default settings, create. And you're going to notice on the Microsoft Docs, one of the first things you have to do is in your program CS, you have to basically enable sessions on the server. And so program.cs, and we need a couple lines of code. So after add controllers with views, we all know that the order of the middleware calls matters. We're going to do builder services. You might have seen me code this one a little bit differently in the past. Add distributed memory caches. Again, kind of saying enable this to go into RAM, right? These session IDs can go into RAM. And then I'm going to do builder services add session. Now this is an interesting code snippet because we can set a timeout from the server when to expire this session. So I'm going to say from seconds, and I'm going to expire this maybe in 5 seconds. So we'll kind of see how this goes, but I'm going to set this cookie to expire in 5 seconds. Okay, so there's 3 lines that we have to add. Add distributed memory cache. This basically says, hey, you can store the session IDs on the server. This says, hey, expire these sessions in a very short duration. And then down below, again, exactly in this location. And then down below, above the map controller route, we just have to say app.useSession. Okay, now this is going to allow us access to create session variables. I'm going to do this, I'm going to mock up like a user login. Okay, and so what I'll do is I'll go to model and I'm going to add a class, and it's just going to be a fake, user class, as if this would be my user that's going to log in. I'm going to give an ID, which is an int, a username, which is a string, and a password. Okay, so not a very complex user class. Okay, so now I'm going to make a controller to basically allow the user to log in. And so I will add a controller. And let's just say this is like a login for a student. So I'll call this my student controller. And the default method here, I'm just going to make a /login public iaction result login. And this is going to be an HTTP GET. And we're going to return to view, which then I need to make a student folder inside of my views. So add a folder called student, because that's the name of my controller. And then I need to make a login Razor view. So I'm going to add a view called login and delete this template stuff here. With a login page, and I'm just going to go to Get Bootstrap, and I'm just going to bring in kind of a form for a login. And you can kind of go here and see this kind of generic email address and password form, which you can copy this on the Bootstrap docs and just kind of bring this in here. Now the ASP action here will be login and the method will be post. And I'm going to change I'm going to add these tag helpers. This login needs to work with my user model. So I'm going to say app model. And I think I could just say student. It might need to give it a full path. Semicolon. Oh, thank you. I named it something different. Give it the right name. It works. So now we have user, and this is going to be an input for, I'll do ASP4 and let that, we'll say username, ASP4 username, and ASP4 username. Okay, and I think that's all I really need to do to change that up. I'm going to do the same thing for my password. ASP4 might have to do a little troubleshooting here. But nonetheless, there's my username, there's my password, there's my button to submit. When I submit, it should go to the login post method, of which we're going to make an HTTP post. Public iAction result login with my user. And I'm going to have to bring in the models. So bring in using session demo models up top. So user is now recognized. And I'm just going to say return to the view. I'm just going to put a breakpoint in right here to make sure that my user is being received when I post the data. And then we're going to save some user information into session. And so if I boot this up with debugging to hit my breakpoint, I should be able to go to /student/login to hit the get. Let that boot up. All right, /student/login. We hit our login page. If I say admin, password of admin, and I hit submit, we hit our post. And if I hover over the variable, our user, password and username are being sent back to our controller. So this is correct. Now, next concept to learn, so we've just kind of wired this up to be ready to go. In a controller, we have HTTP context. And by the way, there's content, NT, and there's context. I've made the mistake of typing content on more than one occasion. That is not correct. It is HTTP context dot session dot look at the methods that are available to us. In session, if I look at setters, look what we can do. We can set a string or we can set an int. So this session, okay, is a property, okay, of the abstract class HTTP context. So here we're saying the class of context, session property, and when we call the setters, we got set string and we got set int32. Maybe that's all you need to work with are strings and ints, but also you can work with more complex types without a whole lot of legwork. Okay, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to introduce this concept of extension methods. Okay, again, what we're going to do is we're going to extend this iSession interface. You see this session property returns an iSession data type. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to extend iSession to give us more methods to work with, more mutators. We're going to be able to set objects, not just set ints and strings. We're going to set objects now to be able to put our whole user inside of session, not just like individual variables, but to put a whole object. Okay, so that's what we're going to do inside of models. I just want to show you that because we haven't really done a whole lot with extension methods, and that's what we're doing here. So I'm going to create a class, and this is boilerplate. You can take this if you've coded this before, and I think you guys have. This is verbatim what we've typed. You can change the name of the methods. Now there's a couple things here. This is a public static class. Okay, that's the first thing, is the name of this class here doesn't matter much. How we extend something, the syntax is interesting. This is not a normal syntax. What we're extending is right here on line 7. See what I've highlighted? We are saying extend this iSession interface. We're going to call it session, but that line right there that I'm highlighting, that is how we determined what methods we're adding this to. So the method we're creating is called setObject. It can take a generic type, so whatever type that you give it, it can take any object type. And what we do inside of here is we say, okay, this session set string, so we're going to take what's called a JSON serializer, basically take this object, convert it to JSON, and save it in a string. And value is the third argument here. Values type is type T. It's a generic type. So we could pass it users, we could pass it products, we could pass it any object that you have, right? This is the idea of generics. Okay, so to get that out of the way, this is putting data in. This is the setter, and the getter is the same thing. We've now added two methods, the method called setObject, the method called getObject. This serializes it into JSON on the way in, ultimately a string that's JSON in that string. And here on the way out, we look at the key, we call get key, and then we deserialize it back into the data type. So here we take the user, convert it to a string. Here we take the string and convert it, deserialize it back into a user. So this is converting between data types, whatever the data type is, into JSON, into a string, from a string into JSON, back into the data type. And if the key is not a good key, you could just see here we're going to return null. Or default type here. So, okay, what does this allow us to do? Let's kind of close this up, go back to our student controller. Now in my HTTP context session, I can do a set and look at our new method. We have setObject, a key and a value here. SetObject, we have to pass it a key, call it current user, and a value of the object u. Awesome. So now when we post to our login form, and maybe what we do is we return home. So I'm going to return redirect to action index controller on home. All right, so we log in, we put the user in a session variable, and we redirect to home. Let's go back to the view for home. If I go Solution Explorer, and I go Views, Home, Index, up here, now I can say, okay, do I have a user equals now? Notice what's out front is context. So if you're accessing a session variable from the view, we are using the context class, okay, that belongs to these Razor pages. Okay, this is actually, it looks like a property. Okay, so we're using context instead of when we were in a controller, we're using HTTP context. But both HTTP context and context have access to session, and I'll show you. See, it's the same property here. Context.session is the same as HTTP context in the controller. Okay, and because we overrode the interface, we can go to get, we call it object, get object. We put the type here, get the user. We put the key as our first argument. What do we call it? We called the key current user. And if there is no user, I did that wrong. Hold on. Let me close my parenthesis here and close that there and make sure I got that right. Okay. So if this is null, notice it'll put a new user into user, which has an empty username and an empty password. Okay, so this double question mark null coalescing operator, if this returns null, then it does this instead. But of course, if it can read out of a session, then it will put it there. And here I'm just going to say at user dot username. Okay, so I'll just put on my home page, I'll put the username on the home page. Just a simple read and write demonstration. Let's see what breaks, if anything breaks. Okay, so no username there at first. That's what I would expect. If I go to student login, I say admin and admin. Now check this out. I have this extension, you guys might remember this browser extension called Edit This Cookie. Okay, this is a Chrome extension. You can install it if you haven't installed it. Let's take a look at our cookies right now. And right now we could see there's one cookie here called anti-forgery. Okay, let me go ahead and submit this. I'll close this extension. Let me submit this. Notice I have my username now posted, so I've put into session, I've read it out. And take a look, I now have this session cookie that's being saved. Remember how long we saved it for? 5 seconds, right? So in theory, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the cookie is now expired. If I refresh the page, the admin goes away. Okay? And so the cookie is still visible, it's still there. Okay, so we created a session variable, we put something in there, it expired after 5 seconds. You can see the expiration date and time right there. And yeah, that's an example of creating a cookie. A session variable, putting it in a cookie. Now, of course, you can go back into here and change the expiration, right? You can change from seconds to from minutes. You can make it, if I say time span dot from, we got days on here, right? So these cookies can last a long time. Also, remember, we don't want to store critical information in here, and there is an upper limitation for how much information you can store on a cookie. Remember, a cookie is a file saved on the client. It's like 4,096 bytes. It's not or maybe that was kilobytes, but the point is it's not infinite storage like a database. Okay, and so you got these different ways you can configure your cookies from seconds, minutes, and so on. So in that demo, I did a write operation, right? I wrote into a session object, we made a cookie, whatever, called current user, we did set object, and then I did a read operation in the view. Okay, so on the student controller, where are we at? Here it is. I did a read operation here, and remember there was HTTP context to write, and then here context in the view. You could, use HTTP context here. Again, so let's see, does that look right? You could do that, and then you could send that user to the view, and then make the view strongly typed, and then do ASP4 and display the username that way. Okay? But the point is that this will be accessible in a bunch of areas on the site, right? It's accessible in different controllers. It's accessible in different views, all over the place, right? We no longer, have to worry about like, where's our data? Do I have access to it? Like, it's great. This is much better. So like in terms of like just thinking out loud here, like we talked about temp data, and temp data goes away. Like, why do you really want that? I mean, we're not storing like sensitive information. Like, why do you want your data to go away? I mean, maybe there's some advantages. I'm just thinking out loud here. But then it's like sessions. Okay, now the data persists a little bit longer, and I like that. So keep the data around, It's like, I like sessions more than I like temp data for that reason. It just kind of keeps it around a little bit longer, which then goes on to, well, let's just save it in a cookie, right? Because a cookie, you could set it to expire in 30 days, and unless the user actually goes into their browser and deletes their cookies, it's going to stick around, right? It's not just, you're not going to lose your data when the browser, closes by default on a session. I guess that's the last part of this demonstration to kind of show is that like this should go away. Like if I go here and I say, hey, keep this for 60 seconds or a minute, right? And I log in, and then I'll close the browser and reopen it up. It's kind of the demo, student login, and I say, okay, and then I go ahead and copy localhost, and I close, and then I kind of reopen that up, it goes away, right? So even though I said 60 seconds, it's still a session, and it still terminates when you close the browser. And just to demo one more time, that if I say admin and I copy and paste, like this is still the same session, still the same browser. If I copy localhost, of course, into a different browser with a different set of cookies, it's not there, right? So it is in Chrome, admin is still there, but it's obviously a different session than a Firefox session, right? So sessions are a per browser basis, not a per tab basis, right? If you close all the tabs, then the session goes away. Well, enter the next tool, which to me is like the best, is just a cookie. A cookie is going to persist data even longer than a session because there's just less ways for it to expire. A session can expire when the server tells it to, or when the client closes the browser window. So those are both ways that you lose the data. And so, I just in general, I kind of like the idea of cookies the best. Yeah.
Do cookies go across browsers? Did you just say that?
No, they're different. They're different.
Cookies are?
Yes.
Okay.
Cookies are not cross-browser. Like you literally would have to clear your Chrome cookies, and that wouldn't touch your Firefox cookies. Those are different locations on the hard drive. So to kind of jump ahead, I will say that, I've read this book, I've done the book exercises, and I'm trying to extract what I think is the most relevant information out for you guys. If you dive into the book, I will point out that they wrap a lot of the logic for sessions into a C# class on page 345. Okay, they're taking these lines that we've written where we are setting objects and getting objects, and they encapsulate them in a C# class. And so I personally see the benefit, but I also feel like it's not necessarily for the scope of what we're doing. So there is, on page 345, a class, a C# class, where you take the logic that we've hard-coded in here and you put that logic into a class. Therefore, to actually set an object, you have to work with the methods out of that class. And it's like that's another layer of, hoops to jump through to ultimately work with session variables. I don't know. It's the way they choose to implement it. But moving on to page 356, and if I kind of pull up the PowerPoint, I guess I can show it on the PowerPoint because to jump ahead, we talked about a lot of this. The only thing I didn't talk about here is how to remove. So if you hit, if you say remove current user, well then that's another way of getting rid of the session, right? It's programmatically ending the session. Okay. Yes.
Would you do that on like a logout?
Yeah. That's a good. Yeah. That's perfect. So hit the /student/logout. How about that? You hit the logout, HTTP contest session, remove current user. Student login /student log out. There you go. And the cookie may still exist, but the data is not in there, right? If the data was in there, then it would read it and put it on the page. Right, so now we have demonstrated a session remove current user. Obviously, you put the key in there, right? That's what you called it. That's the key. Voila. This is that class that I talked about where they wrap these setters and these getters inside of a C# class, and they define, keys for the session identifiers, the session keys. So you can set values in session and get values out of session and remove things out of session. Now they're just encapsulated in a class with its methods to do that instead. And literally last time, this lecture was like an 8-hour lecture because I walked through the book code. And now here I am a year later from an 8-hour lecture walking through the book code. And I don't know that really benefited my students for me to just literally code everything out of the book. I think the time is better spent you coding things out of the book. That's an option. It's not something I'm going to grade, but whether you find that helpful or not, I'll leave up to you to code these book examples. My point is, what is the theory? What is a session? How to add things to session, how to get things out of session. Like, let's hit the high level stuff on how to do this and make it useful. Okay, so that's sessions. Again, the only thing I really didn't hit hard on is wrapping that logic inside of a class. Which, if you remember, the topic of the chapter is how to work with sessions, check, and cookies. That's part 2, is working with cookies. So in the controller class, there's a request property and a response property. So just like we had HTTP context property, we have these other properties that work with cookies. And this line of code right here, remember I said they're like intermixed? I said sessions work with cookies, right? When you have a session variable, it automatically creates a cookie. Well, check this out. When we're creating a cookie, the default cookie is automatically a session cookie, which means when the user closes the browser, it terminates the session. So if you do this line of code, that cookie is only there for the session. Okay? Therefore, you probably want to change that line of code. You probably want to persist your cookie around longer, and the way you do that is with a third argument. You could set a timer on this cookie to say stick around for 30 days. Okay? I actually don't know the maximum cookie duration. That's a really interesting thing to look up. what is a maximum duration for a cookie? You guys want to ask Google or you want to ask ChatGPT?
I Googled it.
400 days. As of Chrome, August 2022, cookies can no longer set an expiration date more than 400 days in the future. Now that's a Chrome restriction. Okay? So you log in to Facebook, you can stay logged in for 400 days according to Chrome security policies. Okay?
It also does say if you set it to more than 400 days, it just sets the 400 days. It doesn't reject.
Oh. So if you say 800 days, it'll default to
So
400.
it won't crash.
It won't crash. So what are we going to do? Let's take it out of a session variable and just put it in a cookie, right? We've got a user. Now, haven't tinkered with this as much as I should have, so there's going to be a little experimentation here. Instead of putting this in a session variable. By the way, request and response object, just like in JavaScript, right? Rec-res, now their full names, request and response. So the server response is where we create the cookie. So server response object is where we create the cookie. So we're going to say response dot cookies. Now, just to take the code snippet, the one thing, and I didn't test, is like, can I store the full user in there? Notice here, I'm not storing the full user. I'm just storing the string. So like, I don't know. That doesn't compile. It says U is not null here. Cannot convert from a user to a string. Okay.
Can you do a session extension?
Well, can we do an extension? I don't know. Let's Google it. Without trying to look it up, maybe we can take a little bit of code snippet where we said, hey, JSON serializer, serialize, and put that in a string. So let's try just to serialize and deserialize. Maybe that's our answer here. JSON serializer, serialize. Okay. So it's not barking too much. So I got current user. And then let's send us home. So again, request response. This is a write operation. Obviously, the response goes down to the client. So you're responding from the server to the client. That's why it's that property. Again, control click and look at it. It is a response property that belongs to the controller, right? This is the abstract class called controller, just a controller class. Okay. So maybe on the now that belongs to the controller. Again, let's read it from here. So let's say user U, and we're not reading from session anymore, right? We're going to say request cookies current user. Now we probably have to deserialize this here, right? So and so the type here is, I'm just trying this, guys. If it doesn't work, okay, now this might be null. So JSON deserialize into a user, request cookies current user, and if it's null, man, this tooltip needs to get out of my face. If it's null, like we did before, we'll just say new user. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to send U to the view, send the letter U to the view. I'm just going to put a breakpoint in here, bless you. And when the page loads, little experimentation here. I should probably put a breakpoint on my, okay, so here it's hitting my breakpoint and value cannot be null, okay. So, okay. So let's see if I don't do this, since it can't be null. Let's see what this does without that. Hits the breakpoint. Same error. Value cannot be null. Hold on. So let's do, maybe we got to make this nullable user, right? That's probably going to help. No.
So, question, because the green squiggly leaves are under the request cookie, if you're trying to deserialize.
Yeah, again, just kind of experimenting here. It's a much easier process to just store a string. Let's just do that. Let's just store a string, and then if we want to fight this battle, we can. But let's just start a little differently. And let's store u.username. Let's just store current user, and then redirect home. So now we're just storing a string. That should make this a little bit easier. And forgive me for clicking around. I'm going to comment out that line of code. I'm going to make this a @model user. @model.username. But then I also have to, when this loads, okay, so this is going to send some sort of user. Let's take the deserialize off and see. Okay, so it wants to now have a string. Oh, well, hold on. String username. Okay, so let's just put this in temp data, right? Temp, or view bag dot username. Okay, that way we don't need to return anything to our view. Okay, sorry for the refactor, but let's just read that into view bag, and then if view bag exists, then we display it here. View bag username. That way we just get that into the view. Okay, let's hit our breakpoint. Okay, that's null, pretty much what I would expect. Home page loads. Let's put another breakpoint over here. So when I post, now keep in mind this is still that session cookie. Let me close. Okay, continue. Student login. Admin here. We hit another breakpoint. Username is admin, so that's going into the view. And there you go. Put it into view bag, pulled it out. Okay. What do we got? Look at here. We got our cookie called current user. Close the browser. It is a session cookie. So the next thing to cover. So let me back up. I apologize for the clunkiness. I hadn't experimented with putting objects in. I do believe there's a way to do that. We could figure that out.
So when will that expire? Because we never really said it.
Yeah, well, it's a session cookie. So when the user closes the browser window, it'll expire. Let's set the option. So like that's probably the next logical question is how to set some options. Which can be done with this. Var options equals new cookie options. So this is going to be where we're going to set an expiration. Expires. Cookie options with curlies. Expires. What do we want to do? Equals system date time now. Let's look at the add seconds. Sure, let's add 5 seconds because who's got the time to wait around? Okay, so there's our cookie options, and then we pass the cookie options as our third argument. We called our variable options. Okay. Now, actually, let's do something like add days, and we'll say 5 days, just so something persists, and we can show that we can close the browser and reopen it and still have our cookie on the page, right? That's the idea here, that our logins would persist. I'm going to take out some breakpoints and take that out. Okay, slash student login, admin's logged in. Here you could see our current user cookie. If I close the browser window, now notice the application is still running. So let me open up a new tab, paste. We could see admin's still there. It's no longer a session. If I close, now I am curious because the server is still running. I'm not sure if I close the server down and relaunch it, if that stays there, but it should. Let's experiment with this one more time. I'm just going to click play. And admin is still there. Let's close the server down. And yeah, there it is. So cool. And if I look at the expiration, March 3rd, 5 days. Very cool. So the only underlying thing that makes me a little like, I wish I could store the whole user. I mean, the worst case scenario, what is a user? A bunch of properties. You can store the properties in the cookies. Did you figure it out? All right, what do we do?
All I do is check if the cookie does not equal to null.
That's all you did?
Yeah.
So I had it. I just had to finish it off. Yeah. Okay, so let's take that back. I'm going to pass the whole user. Okay, so this is refactoring for another time. So I realize you might have to play a little catch up, but I'm going to do this. I'm going to say JSON dot JSON serializer dot serialize you. Okay, so that's going in, and home controller so now this is potentially null. So I'll say user you, and then I get this, and it cannot implicitly convert. Oh, that's got a dot username here. Hold on. Okay, so now we say something like if is what you're saying. You added like an if.
I made a public user variable inside the index method, and all I did was initialize that to a new user. Then underneath that, I checked if this cookie does not equal to null. In JSON, initialize it.
Yeah. So you made a public user.
So on that line, just have that as a new user.
Oh, new user. Okay.
That's just that.
Okay. And then we're gonna read here.
Oh, you're basically gonna check if the cookie is null first.
You check if the cookie is null.
Yeah,
Ah.
'cause I think what we were doing is it could be null before
It shuts the code.
If it's not null, right? If request cookies current user is not null, then we initialize it and set that. Otherwise, we say guest. Okay. I'm good with that. Okay. So we created a empty user, check for null, initialize the username in ViewBag. Still in ViewBag, we're displaying the username. That wasn't so hard, so let's run it. Now our cookie's probably still there. Wah. That's a fun one. JSON. Let me see what I did wrong. I'm sure it's a small mistake. JSON serializer deserialize into a user the request cookie's current user. Oh, my current user is a string. So I got to delete my cookie. I got to delete my cookie because my cookie's a string. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to go here. I'm going to go to localhost and delete my cookie. Go away.
Not sure if this will eventually run into, but a cookie string length.
Now we're not crashing. Now we're guessed. Cookie string length is what?
The max on it, it says it's like 8 kilobytes. I don't know if that. I'm not sure how big that really is.
Hey, now we put the object in the cookie jar. All right. Yeah, I was close. I needed to check for null before I tried to put something into it. And that,
That's crazy.
That ain't good.
That's crazy. Is this a JSON?
I don't think, part of me feels like this should be more complex, but it doesn't have to be. This really isn't the craziest concept in the world. You're taking little bits of information from a web form, saving it into a local file on the user's hard drive. Of course they have local storage. JavaScript has local storage, and you can work with local storage. It doesn't have the same limitations that cookies have. Cookies have a upper bounds of file size that is very limiting, but you don't want to store that much information anyways. So back to the PowerPoint real quick. there's some more options that we can look at. You know, by default, there's no cross-browser or cross-domain cookies. Those are very third-party cookies. I guess you can enable third-party cookies. So I guess that is a thing when I said it's not. The expiration, we kind of covered that, how to set that to expire. You know, the cookie's path, well, that's up for the browser to determine. You're not going to probably change that. Max age, the maximum age for the cookie, that's actually when we created the cookie in the student controller. We kind of set a number of days for the expiration. There's a same site. So if I can do same site equals, and you could set it to strict or lax, and I think there's different ways. So we did some of this in the JavaScript where it's like, hey, we actually had different domains that we were working with, and we had to like loosen our rules to allow some cross-domain cookies kind of things going on. And then there's a secure property, says indicates whether the cookie can be transmitted over HTTPS only. The default value is false. And again, they wrap a lot of the cookie logic into a C# class that you know, but at the end of the day, we're doing the same thing. We got cookies, we're adding cookies. There is a delete method, kind of the same thing as before. And that is the basis of working with cookies and working with sessions. Thankfully, I don't think the C# logic here is too hard. I personally think, you know, just understanding the differences between all the different ways to save state is kind of the challenge. Going back to the earlier, there's a bunch of ways to persist data in a database, in a URL, in a hidden field, in a session variable, in a cookie. There's all these different ways. That's the hardest part for me, to think about all the different ways to persist data. That's the end of that chapter lecture.